started without any hesitation. Let's get started with today's agenda. And first up is a welcome from me. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Crystal, and I work at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. My portfolio is actually support groups, but NPOwer is a project that is so dear to my heart. We're also going to be launching a NPOwer support group, bracket groups, in the near future. So keep a lookout for that. But first of all, I wanted to share a little bit about what today is all about. NGOs in South Africa have been a pillar of strength throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and NPOwer wants to help the NGOs who have been selflessly supporting so many people through very difficult times. The NPOwer Support Program released an NPO mental health survey in October 2020. The purpose of the survey was to understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on the mental health of NPOs, so that we could provide better psychosocial first aid and support to all NPO leaders, staff, and volunteers. So today we're going to be discussing the NPO mental health and COVID-19 survey results, exploring how the feedback gives us deeper insight as to why the survey findings are so significant for NPOs. Over 200 NGOs across South Africa responded to our survey. And for everyone who's joining us today and who took time to complete the survey, just a massive, massive thank you. 60% of NGO professionals who partook in the survey exhibited moderate to severe psychosocial distress, and a further 73% noted an increase in stress levels in the past 6 months. NGOs have also reported that the most frequent stresses that are contributing to their psychosocial distress includes workplace and financial challenges, general stress, anxiety, and family-related concerns. So I was just reading something earlier on today that I want to share with you as to why it is that research is so important. Not only is research an invaluable tool for building on crucial knowledge, it is also the most reliable way that we can begin to understand the complexities of various issues and maintain our integrity as we look and uphold important truths and how to assess and manage our problems. So on that note, just looking at the agenda, so we just did the welcome. So welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to have you here today. Pietri, who works at SADAG and is my fellow colleague, is going to just be giving you a quick recap on who is NPOwer. Then we will be joined by Andrew, who is our researcher and conducted this survey as well as its findings. And then we'll be joined by clinical psychologist Garrett, who will be unpacking with Andy why these statistics are so significant. And then we'll be opening up to a Q&A and then some NPOwer facts and questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pietri.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I was on mute over there. Thank you so much, Crystal, for a great welcoming. Welcome to our speakers and everyone that is here today. We also appreciate taking the time to find out more about what's happening to the mental health of NPOs. So who is NPOwer? Some of you may know, some of you may not. Since the NPOs have always been important in providing support and care to so many South Africans, and this has been highlighted especially throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Although NPOs provide such crucial services, resources are often stretched and teams are often burnt out, overworked, and are facing trauma every single day. Pandemic-related issues have caused so many NPOs to close their doors and to stop these valuable services that help so many South Africans in need. And that's why we've started NPOwer. So NPOwer is a first of its kind NPO support program and 24-hour toll-free helpline that offers free mental health care and support to all NPOs in South Africa. This initiative sees Chikalulu Social Investments partnering with SADAG, who provides psychological first aid to all NPOs, leaders, staff, and volunteers, many of whom are experiencing unprecedented strain and burnout. So that's basically what NPOwer is. We will carry on some more, we will go into more detail as to what NPOwer really does in the FAQs, but if you have any questions as to how NPOwer can help you, please just pop them in the chat box, or you can send an email in the contact details that we will show you later. So that's it from me. Thanks so much, Crystal, and I hope everyone enjoys the presentation today.
Thanks so much, Pietri. Just to re-emphasize what Pietri just said, we want to hear from you. So please make use of the chat box. We're going to be monitoring it throughout today's presentation. And if you have any questions, just pop them in the box and we will get back to them. Okay, so without further ado, I would love to present, or rather introduce, Andrew Wuyang Kim. He is a biological anthropologist and human biologist studying the life course and intergenerational mental health consequences of political violence, as well as public health strategies aimed at helping communities overcome historical trauma and improving global mental health. I met Andy about a year and a half ago. As soon as he starts chatting, you will hear his very American accent. I did have a massive chuckle when I phoned him earlier on this morning, and he was like, "How's it?" And I was like, "They're going to know when you go to America that you have been with us." But we've been so blessed to have you. We are so grateful for the research that you have done and the time and effort you've put into the survey. So thank you, and a very warm welcome.
Great, thanks so much, Crystal. I really appreciate the introduction, and maybe if we're lucky, I'll share some other South Africanisms. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Wonderful. And Crystal, can you see that? Wonderful, great. Thanks so much, everyone. As Crystal mentioned, my name is Andy. I'm currently a research fellow at the Center for Global Health in Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, as well as Harvard Medical School, and currently based at the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand-Wits here in Joburg. And I've had the distinct pleasure of working alongside Chikalulu and SADAG to both design, implement, and analyze this really important survey that many of you graciously completed for us in order to understand what were the experiences of NGOs during the pandemic, what are the mental health needs, and how can SADAG and Chikalulu, as well as other organizations, use these data to improve mental health well-being, and also at the same time, simultaneously improve the quality of work and experience of NGO workers across the country. So today I'll be presenting you the findings and providing some recommendations from our data. So to give you a little bit of context, we knew that even before COVID-19 came to South Africa's shores in March, came to South Africa in March 2020, we knew that mental health in South Africa was already a large problem, both in the country and relative to other countries worldwide. So the rates of psychiatric morbidity are among the highest in the sub-Saharan continent. Only a quarter of cases of severe cases are treated, meaning that 75% of cases aren't treated. And within the quarter of people who are accessing care, only a quarter of them actually, or a quarter of those who are severe, only a quarter of them are actually accessing care. We know that there's also low rates of medical aid access, as well as access to other forms of psychiatric care, both from the primary to the tertiary level. And all these statistics come together to show that the mental health systems, in particular the public mental health system in South Africa, is both overburdened and under-resourced. So then comes COVID-19 in South Africa. And there are a number of reasons as to why the introduction of COVID to South Africa was particularly concerning. Of course, we know that there are high rates of pre-existing comorbidities, other intersecting disease epidemics such as non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes, other cardiometabolic diseases, as well as infectious diseases like HIV and TB. But there are also being a number of concerns related to different forms of social marginalization, such as poverty and unemployment.
Sorry, Andy, to interrupt. I can't see your whole screen. So some of your presentation's just being cut off. I'm not sure if you can zoom out a little.
All right, let's see. Let me try to reshare it.
Thanks so much. It's such important information, so I just want to make sure everyone can see.
Sure. How's this?
It's the same.
Is it the same? Are other people having this issue?
I'm not having the same issue.
Yeah, I think we're fine. Crystal,
Okay.
it's fine on my side as well, so I think we're good.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry about
that, Crystal. We can. No problem. We'll have a one-on-one conversation if you have other questions. Sure. So as I was saying, after the onset of COVID-19, there were also a number of different concerns related to mental health after the onset of the pandemic. And we saw this quickly within the first couple of weeks after the institution of the national lockdown and quarantine. So we've seen, especially over time, that the quarantine has exacerbated a number of different socioeconomic adversities, such as poverty, hunger, lack of access to different educational resources. Different people also had various levels of access to social distancing protocols as other risk mitigation protocols, such as adhering to the quarantine. And in addition to the limited access to different resources and safety measures, in addition to that, there were also rather harsh enforcement of government sanctions peppered all throughout the lockdown, especially through the use of enforced police brutality. Now, in addition to the social ramifications of COVID, amongst individuals who had pre-existing diseases or were known mental health care users, there are a variety of different concerns that came about, such as the possibility of individuals defaulting on their medications, lower adherence to psychiatric treatment, but also other forms of medication intake. And while these data haven't been confirmed statistically or in a rigorous study, we have noted a number of these cases being reported anecdotally across providers across the country and worldwide. And finally, we know that there's growing information about the neuropsychiatric sequelae, or these unique mental health impacts of COVID-19 infection immediately after infection, but also even a few months after one has recovered from COVID-19. So there are a number of concerns, both primary and secondary effects of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the pandemic largely, that are cause of concern for overall public mental health. So in one recent study, we found that we tried to assess the mental health impacts of COVID in a large, diverse and marginalized community in Soweto. And after conducting this epidemiological study where we assess people's experiences under lockdown and assess their mental health impact, their mental health status, we found that there was a higher perceived risk of COVID-19 infection is associated with greater depressive symptoms especially among individuals with high levels of childhood trauma. And what these data underscore are that not only are the impacts of the social experiences of COVID, specifically under lockdown and stress that comes from COVID and the potential risk for COVID infection is directly and significantly associated with greater levels of depressive symptoms and poor mental health, but that these effects are compounded if individuals have high levels of social adversity from their life course, especially during childhood. And this is particularly a cause for concern for individuals who grew up in the apartheid past under very difficult and oppressive conditions. Additionally, in a recent study that we conducted among healthcare workers, who are another group of concern during the pandemic, we found similar findings where a greater level of stress related to COVID. So this is specifically adverse experiences that healthcare workers face.
Hi there, I'm not sure if it's just me being a little technically challenged, but we seem to have lost sound. So if you can just bear with us for a few minutes, Pietrie's going to give Andrew a quick phone call to find out where he has gone. I'm just going to see when Andy has joined us again. If you want to take this opportunity to just have a nice big stretch, hopefully it isn't load shedding. It's a peculiar start, a peculiar time, although it is a little bit unexpected and unpredictable. So let's just wait to see if he can rejoin us or what is going to happen. Sorry for this, this less than ideal situation. Obviously, it is a reality that we live in, and it is something that happens. While we work it out, if you just want to go grab a cup of tea, we'll be back with you as soon as possible. Oh, wait, I think...
Sorry, guys, I'm back.
We missed you.
Yeah, sorry. I can't even blame that to load shedding. Okay, so going back to what I was saying, are we ready to go back, Crystal? Is the presentation recording? Okay, wonderful. So what I was saying before was that, we have evidence that shows that there are pretty significant mental health impacts related to COVID-19 stress, both in the general population as well as among healthcare workers. But one thing that we all have collectively known just through our own lived experience as those working in the NGO space is that a number of other sectors have also been facing high levels of distress related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is particularly relevant for the NGO sector. So as you can see here, a number of different news reports have come out citing both greater levels of stress that NGO workers have been facing, as well as the larger social conditions that have led NGOs to really come into the forefront and provide essential resources for quite an extended period of time since COVID-19 pandemic hit. One thing that I wanted to just reemphasize that Crystal had raised already was that we would love to hear what other people's experiences were during this time, both before COVID, during COVID, and currently. So please do share those in the chat box, and we'll be interested in engaging with those experiences and comments. So given the fact that we knew that people in the NGO sector and different organizations were having a lot of difficulty providing assistance for other people, and in addition to that, also having limited resources to supporting themselves and the work that they're doing, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG, collaborated with Chikalulu Social Investments to create this new initiative called NPOwer. And for those who don't know, NPOwer is just a shorter term for the larger program, the NPOwer Mental Health Support Program. And NPOwer had two particular aims. The first was to provide psychological first aid for different NPO and NGO leaders, staff, and volunteers, but also to assess and address the different social experiences and adversities that NGOs have faced, including stress, burnout, and other difficulties that organizations experienced during COVID-19. And these data are really important to understand what people's needs are, both in terms of capacity building, service delivery, and mental health, but also generating data in order for us to provide evidence-based solutions to help build capacity and help NGOs complete the work, the very important work that you all have been providing both before the pandemic now and into the future. And the last thing I think I want to raise here is that, we know that there's been a lot of evidence that shows that poor levels of mental health are also tightly correlated to work output and the quality of work that people provide. So also improving mental health has a dual impact, and also improving the output and quality of work that NGO workers provide on a daily basis. So there are two parts to NPOwer. The first was the development of a container-based telephonic counseling system, which was embedded to a pre-existing call center that many of you all know SADAG runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the second was an online survey that we had designed collectively, SADAG, myself, and Chikalulu. So this, there are two different parts of data collection when it came to the survey. The first was through the dissemination of the online survey between October 2020 and March 2021, and there are a number of different metrics that we assessed. So just demographic characteristics of the person completing the survey, different characteristics of the organization, such as size, capacity, different resources offered, different sources of stress during the pandemic, as well as a psychological screener for psychiatric disease risk. In addition to that, among a smaller subset of individuals who requested that we contact them through the NPOwer helpline, we conducted additional follow-up questioning around their experiences related to stress, their needs, and also kept an inventory of what resources were provided during these calls. So the data I'll be presenting to you today come from two different sources: the survey, the online survey, as well as qualitative data that have come from the helpline. So there are two bodies of results I'll be presenting you today. The first are just general characteristics of the survey, and the second will be related to experiences of stress and mental health. So going into the results. So first, I wanted to provide a snapshot of who completed the survey, so who was involved in data collection. So as you see here, there was a fairly high rate of of non-response to a lot of the questions across the survey. So I want to just emphasize that from the get-go, that although there are statistics that we provide on demographics and other experiences, this isn't necessarily representative of the entire group of people who participated in the survey, because of course people had the opportunity to opt out of answering certain questions. But we still do have a lot of important information among those who did provide responses. So in general, a plurality of individuals were between the ages of 31 to 40. The majority of participants who provided information on their gender were female, and among individuals who provide information on the racial group, we had most of our participants identify as Black and white, followed by colored and Indian. We also asked about the position of the survey respondent in their NGO. A large portion of individuals were either high in leadership as a director or manager, or the founder of the NGO, and a smaller portion of respondents were actually staff members or volunteers at the NGO. We know that staff members and volunteers a lot of the time are on the front lines and providing these forms of social assistance. So just to keep this in mind in terms of how whose experiences are being captured in these results. Most of our NGOs who participated in our survey came from Gauteng and the Western Cape, followed by KZN and the rest of the provinces. So we have an overrepresentation of individuals coming from Gauteng and the Western Cape. And there was a pretty even distribution of different staff sizes across the NGOs. We also wanted to see what were the different modes of communication that NGOs typically partook in. And as we see here, WhatsApp, Zoom, and Microsoft Teams were the top 3 most prevalent tools for communication amongst NGO teams. So going into the results on stress and mental health. So the first set of questions that we asked were around different experiences of stress and stressors during the COVID-19 pandemic. And here I have 2 different data points that I want to show. So on the left is a bar graph where we show the frequency of different stressors that were experienced by the different survey respondents. And as you can see here, the most prevalent source of stress came from work-related challenges. And this was broadly defined. So we provided a checklist, and people just provided the different types of stressors that they experienced at the time of survey data collection. The second most prevalent stress exposure was related to financial stress, followed by stress and anxiety, which were closely related in terms of prevalence rates. On the right, we see we asked individuals whether their levels of stress changed in the past 6 months. So that was during the course of the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, a large majority of individuals mentioned that they did find an increase in their stress levels. Another form of stress that we assessed was related to psychiatric disease risk, and this was assessed using the Kessler-10 or the Kessler-10 psychological distress scale. And this is an important measure because it's a widely used, internationally utilized and validated measure of psychiatric disease that's been widely implemented across different South African populations. So we're also able to compare levels of psychiatric distress within this sample to others. And I would say that this is probably the most important finding in the survey. And here we find that approximately 66% of respondents reported at least having moderate psychological morbidity at the time of data collection. And specifically what this means is that individuals were at a risk of developing or already exhibiting a psychological disorder. In addition to that, we found that 51% of the sample surpassed the clinical cutoff for exhibiting symptoms of a present state mental disorder. The clinical cutoff was assessed using a measure of 24 points or higher on the Kessler-10. Overall, these data points just show that there are high levels of psychiatric morbidity within the sample. When you compare these levels across other groups around the world, the findings are actually quite shocking. We find that compared to other samples in the literature, such as new refugees, peacekeepers in different war-torn countries, the levels of psychiatric disease risk that we find in this sample of NGO workers is comparable or higher than those in other risk groups across the world. So it's important to contrast the level of psychiatric morbidity with the availability of mental health resources that people have or don't have access to. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we know that the levels of mental health accessibility are quite low. And we also know that there's hesitance to partake in different forms of both public and private mental health care, as well as high levels of stigma against mental health. So here I'm showing two data points. On the left, we have we surveyed individuals asking about the availability of different mental health resources that their NGOs offered. And as you can see here, there were the most prevalent form of mental health resources that NGOs offered were debriefing sessions, followed by individual counseling or peer coaching, followed by support groups within the NGO. In addition to that, we also wanted to see how many mental health resources did the NGO provide to their staff. And as you can see, only 11 different participants reported that their NGO offered 3 mental health resources or more, and fewer numbers as the number of mental health resources go down. And finally, we assess individuals' reasons for contacting NPOwer. So we had the 24-hour helpline available for people to call, and the most common reason for utilizing the NPOwer service was related to the stress and anxiety that people were experiencing during the lockdown and during COVID, followed by just wanting to get information about mental health resources and NPOwer as a whole. And then a much smaller percentage just wanting to learn more about mental health specifically. So we were able to compile all these data points together to run a nice statistical analysis to empirically assess the predictors of psychiatric morbidity. So the statistical analysis allows us to understand, what are significant risk factors or protective factors against poor mental health. And after running this multiple regression model, we find that greater number of COVID-related stressors. So that was related. So those are stressors that I presented just now, related to work-related stress or family stress and financial stress. So greater number of COVID-related stressors and fewer psychosocial resources that NGOs provided to their staff are associated with greater psychiatric symptoms. In addition to this, we find that men are actually exhibiting worse mental health. And this is a particularly interesting finding because epidemiologically, women tend to be at a greater risk of developing psychiatric diseases or having higher levels of psychiatric morbidity. But here we actually see the opposite, in that men are exhibiting worse mental health in this sample. And finally, we have qualitative findings that come from the NPOwer calls. So there are four major areas that I wanted to emphasize that came from our analysis of the NPOwer call logs. First was that people who accessed the NPOwer resource were extremely thankful for the resource for being available. So one participant said, quote, "I have called NPOwer and was debriefed telephonically by a particular counselor. It was most helpful. You are recognized and appreciated." The content of NPOwer calls included stress, anxiety, experiences of grief and loss, especially related to individuals losing a loved one, very high levels of burnout and saline experiences of work-related distress, and a variety of different symptoms that came from internalizing that stress, such as insomnia, bodily pain, rumination, such as thinking too much, etc. When we asked people about their perceptions of the NPOwer helpline, people were extremely relieved to know that this resource existed and that they were able to seek this resource. People were also very eager to engage with the counselors in the NPOwer helpline and work through their problems, whether it was related to work or their mental health or other family-related stressors. And a lot of individuals, interestingly, talked about the feeling and importance of feeling seen. So a number of different respondents expressed commonly that they just felt like a lot of other people wouldn't be able to relate with their experience as an NGO worker, and that speaking to someone about their experiences made them feel validated. And the last major finding was related to health-seeking behavior. So when asked whether the respondent or the NGO worker had reached out to a professional psychologist or another source of professional mental health care, many people said no, they did not reach out for professional psychological assistance. There were, in contrast, higher levels, relatively high levels of over-the-counter medication use, such as the use of Calmets or other substances. And in addition to that, all the counselors provided some form of psychological containment and self-help tips for those who were seeking assistance. So this study is not without very important limitations. So first, as I mentioned before, I talked about the results that there were pretty important sources of measurement error in that individuals gave the opportunity to, or we provided individuals the opportunity to skip questions based on their level of comfort, or for other reasons. And for that, we don't have data on all the participants. So that's just an important caveat to mention. The survey was rather brief, which I think is important given the fact that, especially during COVID, I think, and even before, a lot of people were experiencing survey fatigue. But the trade-off being that there were less data points that we could access in order to really get a more comprehensive and thorough understanding of people's lived experience. This was a cross-sectional survey, so meaning that these questions were all asked at the same time. So we weren't necessarily able to see how people's experiences changed over time or had a clear, accurate representation of people's experiences with stress over the course of the lockdown. All of their responses were retrospective. And finally, there is a possibility for sampling bias due to the fact that people needed to have some form of data or internet or electronic device to complete the survey. But in taking all our results into consideration, survey design, as well as the limitations, we still do find these data points to be extremely informative, and there are a number of conclusions that we can take away from these data. So the first is that most importantly, that NGO professionals in our sample experienced moderate to high levels of psychiatric distress and faced elevated levels of mental illness risk. COVID-related stress and low availability of mental health resources offered in the NGO, as well as being male, were risk factors for greater levels of psychiatric distress. People who accessed NPOwer were extremely thankful for the service and really emphasize the need for this type of psychological assistance and containment. And overall, it seems that NPOwer is an extremely important resource, especially amidst the limited mental health resource ecology that we see in this country, both in the public and private sector. And then all these data points, I think, come together to show that immediate longer-term acute support for NGO professionals are extremely important, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are a few takeaways or recommendations that we've provided in this report, and this report will be publicly available sometime soon. So in the report, you'll be able to see all of the results and the methodology, as well as a fuller description of the recommendations. But there are 6 recommendations that I've briefly summarized here. So the first is the importance of providing immediate mental health services for staff. The second is to manage expectations and clarify roles and responsibilities of both staff and clients, especially given the fact that we know that many NGOs are already so resource strapped and have limited capacity. The third is that simple structured touch points with different staff members can help identify challenges and identify potential solutions to address those challenges. Paying extra attention to schedules, time off, and managing people's workload can help identify any staff that are feeling overloaded and are at particular risk for poor physical, mental health, burnout, etc. Organizing civil programming internally to enhance staff mental health can really go a long way, and that was really saliently observed in our data. And finally, it's important to communicate with other NGOs, other civil society organizations, and other groups to try to maximize resource allocations or solutions and solve problems together. Great. So those are our results. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Garrett Barnwell, to provide some reflections on these results.
Cool. Thanks very much, Andy. I appreciate it. It's quite incredible to see what SADC's doing. So just to introduce myself, my name's Garrett. I'm a clinical psychologist, but worked in the NGO sector for the past probably about 10 years, mainly for Doctors Without Borders. And I left them around about 4 years ago and moved into private practice, and mainly now work with healthcare workers and NGO staff, actually. So I really enjoy still having this kind of connection with the civil society. But just to reflect a bit on the results, I think, so 2020 and this year has been a dramatic year for, I think, everyone working in this sector. And we've been confronted with a lot, quite unexpectedly. And so what I think the results, first of all, it's absolutely amazing the kind of work that's been done by SADC, and it's definitely filling a gap in the provision of services. And I'll speak a bit to that later. But I thought about, okay, well, what is the context at the moment? And I'm really happy with everyone that's come or joined the call, because there's, I think, a wealth of knowledge, and I'd be very interested afterwards to see how people are coping with the pandemic and the kind of forms of accompaniments and strategies that have emerged in your different workplaces. Over the last year, working with people in my practice, what I've, I think one thing that COVID has shown us is that mental health is an individual issue. that it's tied to these broader structural changes, and it's very hard to separate the boundaries between different parts of our lives. And then another experience of COVID was the sense of social isolation and disconnection. We also know in the places where we work that everyone has been affected, but different staff are affected in different ways. So first of all, staff have different types of exposures at work, in their home situation. And then like what Andy's results showed as well, different kind of financial pressures. So we know that some projects lost funding, and then also some staff members took certain cuts as well in the last year. We also know that, different places where people live are more conducive, or can be marked by kind of distress. So we know that the regulations for some who were able to socially distance themselves, or physically distance, themselves, for some it was easier. For others, it actually created a sense of insecurity as well when we think about the police monitoring and stuff that took place. Some of our staff are living with health conditions, so they're at greater exposure as well, and it's higher risk, and so forth. So really different staff are affected in very different ways. Just on a very practical level, some staff have access to computers while other staff don't. So we also need to think about these kind of inequities within the workplace. Then as well, as NGO kind of workers, whether permanent or lay workers, there's this desire to always do more. And at first we were expecting with the COVID crisis that this would end in the first couple of months. We do the lockdown, so we all pushed it at 120%. And but we're realizing that it's a more kind of chronic issue now. And how do we create kind of conditions for staff that are more sustainable in the long run? The other thing is, with the exposures, there's a sense of, wanting to do more, but also not being able to, that the civil society has been quite overwhelmed. If you look at some of the statistics that are coming out about hunger, access to schooling and so forth. So, and for instance, with our HIV programs, we know that testing has gone down and stuff like that. So we also, it can be quite dispiriting because we're not achieving some of those goals and stuff. So a person, as an organization, we need to be aware of kind of these expectations, the funders, and internally we have, and how to reorientate some of these expectations, and then also celebrate some of the little wins that come along. Let me think as well. So the other thing as well is that I don't think there's been anyone that hasn't been affected by loss and grief. For some staff, there's funerals taking place quite frequently. And so that's something to bear in mind working in these places. And I appreciate in the sharing section how some of these forms of, we should be asking, how do we accompany one another during these times? And more recently maybe, but also in the beginning of the pandemic, is that the effects of the pandemic are different for different people. So there are these experiences of injustice that certain staff members are exposed to. And now we have also these unequal feelings about vaccine access and so forth. So just also being aware that it's not only mental health isn't just an interior kind of experience. We influenced by these experiences of how we relate to justice, how we relate to the communities around us, and so forth. And I think for me, in my private practice, that's just been a very dominant theme at the moment. Yeah, so, you know, thinking a bit about the context, I think what Andy's and SADC's research shows is that there's a tremendous need. We know some things that haven't been said maybe is that we know that mental health care services are life-saving. So for people who are struggling or and maybe experiencing some sense of suicidality, hopelessness, helplessness and stuff, getting access early to care is really important. And that finding that Andy has about men is really concerning, because we know that men present late to services sometimes, so we bottle things up. And I think that sense of we need to think a bit differently about masculinity and how to encourage one another to access care and being able to create reflexive and caring spaces for one another in the workplace. You know, coming from MSF for this international humanitarian sector, there is this kind of, you need to just take on everything, and you need to be able to deal with the kind of tragedies and suffering and stuff. And it is really important to speak about the experiences that you're having or any distress that you're experiencing with staff. So then the other thing as well is thinking about mental health care services or just these spaces that are created in work. A lot of people access services late, but really these kind of spaces can help just set boundaries, think through work challenges, navigating kind of complex relationships and deal with some of the distress that you're feeling. So definitely encouraging one another to be there for one another or find spaces. Then thinking about, so in the past, so I haven't only worked as a psychologist. I was actually the president of MSF in Southern Africa, and then also worked as the deputy director at a stage in South Africa. So we know, and I think that this is really important, because one of the main findings that this survey came from is actually, it's about workplace stresses. And how do we think about workplace stresses as managers or project managers and colleagues? And I think I just want to affirm everything that SADC has said about clarifying expectations during these times, knowing when to being very sure, because during COVID, a lot of people's roles changed. So people were moved from HIV testing to now screening for COVID-19, making sure that people have a clear understanding of their roles and responsibilities, but also ensuring that there's boundaries that are being set, so that trying to get rid of that uncertainty that's there, or being realistic about the time that people have. Then also we know that there's been salary cuts and changes to programming, just being very transparent with staff. I know that a lot of the organizations don't always know what's happening with funding, but being transparent and clearly communicating when you do have access to information. We work in an industry full of caring people that give a lot of themselves to their work, and being sure that, you know, we're monitoring people's time off. How late are people working? Do they need some time for rest? What's their workload at the moment? And where are they at as well? So that maybe goes to Andy's point about the touch points. You know, knowing where your team is, reflecting on kind of the previous week, thinking about what has been achieved and looking towards the future. So, and during times of crisis, we're in a different stage now, it's more chronic. So you've probably found your feet a bit more, but also knowing where the team is and showing that sense of leadership. So other kind of things, some, you may not have, I'm assuming because there's a mental health programming in many NGOs, that there might not be a mental well-being policy. So working with a very simple strategy with the team, thinking about what could be basics could be helpful. What else did I want to say? And then also, I think, there's sometimes the expectation that a mental health care professional is going to solve everything. So you can call someone in, they'll do a workshop and everything's going to be better. But it's really about thinking about the conditions at work, being able to create, like that other finding that Andy brought up, about the particular components that promote a generative environment within the workplace. So celebrating some of the ones as well. It's often about being solution focused and solving the problem, but actually taking time to celebrate and consolidate at the moment. And yeah, and I think that's about it. The last thing is maybe just realizing that different staff members aren't only differently exposed or have different risks, but they also at very different points. So yeah, and I think just from my perspective is I want to say thanks for holding everything together through COVID, because you've done so much for the country.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks so much, Garrett, for those really insightful comments. There are a number of questions that have come up in the chat and important comments that I just wanted to raise and get your insights on, but also open up to the rest of the participants in this call, especially because of the fact that, you guys are the experts in this. This is your lived experience. This is your insight, and you all are the ones are on the ground. So it'd be also great to hear from you. One thing that I really wanted to ask you, Garrett, that's related to some of the comments that people have brought up both in the survey and in the chat box around just managing so many different pressures, both within the workforce, within your people's personal lives, and then just the complications that come from trying to manage all of those things at the same time. I think that's a common reality that a lot of NGO and thinking about potential solutions and relating this to our recommendations. One thing that we've talked about and that you brought up before was on touch points. How did these different touch points actually could potentially improve mental health? And I think one thing that I think about as someone who also previously worked in the NGO sector is that, especially as potential managers, that we're already doing so much. Of course, we know mental health is an important resource that's directly affecting the well-being and productivity of our staff members. But to a certain extent, it just seems like another thing to add on top of a very heavy workload already. I think the idea of a touch point is really important because it makes it very approachable. And I think as many of us in mental health know, that a little goes a long way. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why are these touch points important? How can they be implemented within a very busy NGO setting, and if you could provide some examples of that for people.
So you can do it, I think probably there's quite a few NGOs that already probably do it. So you would have it maybe on a Friday or something as a consolidation session. You can, so people would give updates about their work that they've done over the last week, but it's not a kind of So there's a point of knowing where the team is, but you can also have that a part in that session. Okay, how are you doing? How's your team coping with the kind of pressures at the moment? And for manager, I think it's very useful because you know where your team is at that moment, but you're also able to, I think is, you know, one of the hardest experiences as managers, the feeling of loneliness in making these decisions. So also having the team there to utilize and thinking through some of these issues. It can be as a project team, it can be as the managerial team. So it really depends on the workplace. And it's quite hard to think about recommendations because that's another thing is the NGO sector is so incredibly diverse in South Africa. But some of these kind of simple solutions, just making sure that you're able to pick up something, pick up a staff that may be struggling, you doing a bit of preventative practices to ensure that you're not burning people out. Or if someone is showing any kind of challenges and stuff that you're able to refer. I want to speak to that as well. You know, in South Africa, a lot of the burden is placed on, because there isn't a strong public mental health care system. Also, from my experience working with it, we've got a 92% gap in treatment, according to a recent study that came out, I think it was 2 years ago, by people working at UCT in Stellenbosch. And so a lot of the responsibility kind of for mental health falls on the NGO or on the family and community. And so thinking about it as a manager as well, you need to think about what's a responsible referral. So, you know, our staff members, if we are encouraging them to access the public mental health care system or access a psychologist, are they able to actually access one? Are there any financial barriers? Are there any, does the nearest clinic actually have a psychologist, and do they see people for more than one session? So it's just also looking at the reality. And then there's also what I'd love to know from the people who've joined the chat is there's many other kind of community processes that happen that have been showed at the moment. So there's groups, people, I think in your other research as well, Andy, people accessing churches in communities. There's all these kind of informal spaces that are very supportive and healing as well.
Great, awesome, thanks so much. And I wanted to ask one more question to you, Garrett, especially given your area of focus and specialty in your practice. You know, one major find, and you touched on this a bit in your response, but one major finding that we found was that men are faring worse than women in our sample, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you know, only men are suffering and that women aren't, but we do see this gendered pattern. A number of people in the chat box have talked about you know, issues of masculinity, the idea that boys don't cry, and socialization of a particular relationship with mental health, one's emotions, their social identity over time, and you know, this potentially leading to people's help-seeking behavior or the reluctance to access mental health resources. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen based on your experience as a psychologist and a mental health care worker, also in an NGO setting, when it comes to healthcare seeking among men, and maybe some solutions that you've found that have been helpful to encourage men to seek mental health care?
It's a hard question, but men are problematic. So maybe just to say that. And I think in many ways, the industry also reinforces it sometimes. I like the narratives of solidarity that we have in South Africa, but there is the sense of masculinity that Pepe in the chat mentioned as well. And I think that there's something there as well in terms of the kind of support the men can give. So very interesting. I think in my private practice, I see mostly men, which is quite interesting. And I think that once you have a space with other men to be able to speak about some of the challenges and stuff can be quite liberating. A person also needs to be quite sensitive as well. So for many men, it would be a first time speaking through things and stuff. And then I think just in this time, focusing on some of the generative themes. So we're not going down to when you with one another, you're showing support if they're going through any challenges or grief or loss or having problems at work, but you're not going to kind of exercise people with trying to bring up all the negativity and stuff. And I think that this moment really calls for a kind of positive solidarity with one another, and but not being afraid of sharing how we feel. And so that's kind of my thoughts. But there's some beautiful, which I can share later, some really beautiful writing on masculinity and psychology in South Africa that are also creating like very different narratives. A lot of stuff coming out from that.
Great, thanks so much. And now I'll turn it over to Crystal.
Hi, thanks so much, Andrew and Gareth. It was so informative and I think really helpful. So we're going to move on to general questions and answers. And for anyone who wants to plug in, or if you do have a question specifically for Andy or for Gareth, just pop it into the chat box. So one of the questions we received was from Yolanda. Is there a platform where various NGOs can share some resilience strategies? For example, sharing a helpful resource with others. I think sharing is caring at all times. And so absolutely, if you do have some great ideas, or if you do know of some resources, please share them with us, and then we can share them with other NGOs. What I wanted to do quickly was just to share the website with you so that you can familiarize yourself with all the different ways that we can help. So this is the NPOwer website. And what I've done is, I'm just going to go home so that you can see. So you can see it's very clearly outlined how you can contact us through our helpline, through our website, and so on and so forth, as well as our SMS line and our email line. But going back to Yolanda's question about resources, is if you go to mental health info, there are a variety of topics and helpful articles on the website that you can access. But even more so in terms of some of the other questions that came up, such as capacity building and that sort of thing, if you go to online resources, mental health resources, you will find a variety of different videos, specifically stress in the workplace, panic, and so on and so forth. As I'm sure that you know, NPOwer is an initiative between SADAG and Chikalulu. And so the SADAG website is also, it's just a treasure trove. If you spend time on there, the webinars, the handouts, the information, which are all free to access, free to print, free to download, no problem at all. So just going back to some of the questions that I've pulled up during the chat is, Masejo asked, what kinds of capacity building workshops are available for NPOs? If your NPO is struggling with anything mental health related, anxiety, stress in the workplace, insecurities and fears surrounding COVID, please pop us an email and we can look at how we can individually assist your organization. Pepe, you asked, the LGBT community was particularly impacted as their family support levels are often very limited or stressful. But it's a reality that so many people face. So again, phone us on one of our helplines, either NPOwer helplines or SADAG helpline. In regards to the LGBTQI plus community, we do have a lot of resources available where you can get help and support, and we can share those with the individual callers. Also at this time, just a quick reminder, Pietri will just pop it in the chat box. If you could fill out our feedback survey, it would be incredibly helpful for us and also give us an idea of how we can assist you in the future. Chantal says our biggest challenge is prioritizing the health and safety of our children, multi-disabled, while also supporting the staff who seem to be becoming increasingly desensitized to the COVID risk and exposing themselves and our children. Staff and including management are feeling burnt out and struggling to cope with the workload. Absolutely. I think, Chantal, you've just really emphasized why we are here today. We can help. We can offer mental health support, be it on an individual level, a management level, or an organizational level. We are here to offer help and support. So please do phone one of our phone number. Pietri will also just pop that in the chat box for us. There is help out there, and I really cannot emphasize enough, because this is most certainly a serious concern. All of these phone calls are entirely anonymous and confidential. Well, we will ask for your information, but you don't have to give it to us if you don't want to. And it is totally confidential. You'll speak to a counselor. They'll be able to chat to you about what your problem is, what you're going through, and how we can be of assistance and support. I think Chantal's sentiment was echoed by Nontu, who said, despite a lot of organizations having mental health support, a lot of people feel uncomfortable about reaching out to that support. And I think there is stigma surrounding mental health. There is a lot of miseducation, misunderstanding, not really knowing how it will be perceived to share, look, I've got a problem, I'm struggling. Especially in the workplace where there is so much fear, as Andy mentioned, about unemployment, retrenchment. All of SADAG and NPOwer's phone calls are confidential. So if you do know of someone who maybe is feeling really afraid of reaching out to get that help, you are more than welcome to share their details with them. It's so scary, the stigma surrounding mental health, and it's so scary to be like, I'm not coping, and considering the potential ramifications of that. But the sooner we can help you, the sooner you reach out, the better. Andy, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm sorry, my internet's been going in and out, but yeah, I mean, I think like, look, with the data that we show, it's not just recent experiences of of stress and trauma that have impacted people. It's really a life course thing. It's an intergenerational process, and I think just in terms of the way that this country was founded and the ongoing inequities that continue to disproportionately affect people across race, class, and gender lines, that this a lot of different barriers that folks face. So, and even with just, you know, taking that one step towards, you know, seeking help, calling the call center, speaking to someone about, you know, your problems, you know, talking to, you know, the gogo in your neighborhood or at church. You know, there are different forms of mental health resources that don't necessarily have to be you talking to a stranger. And that's just really the first step, and a really important step that, you know, people can take to really break that cycle. And I think, you know, even a small step really goes a long way.
Absolutely. And taking that first step can be so overwhelming, but it can also make the most ginormous difference. And sometimes it's hard to think like, how can making a phone call help me? Things are so bad, they are so terrible. A problem shared is a problem halved, and we do have so many resources that we aren't aware of, or a lot of times we don't know exist. So Phone NPOwer, and they'll be able to share these resources with you. We have resources available for all demographics, for all levels of, you know, if you have access to medical aid, if you don't have access to medical aid, there is help regardless. So please do give us a shout. Garrett, if you're still with us, maybe you could try and give some reassurance to those who are kind of feeling like, I don't feel like anyone can help me. I feel I'm so alone right now.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. Yeah, I think that what, you know, maybe what really stands out for me in the survey out of these results is that there's many people that are experiencing similar but different, or having similar but different experiences, and there are spaces. So therapy, you know, you accessing, whether it's SADC or whether it's therapy and stuff, just taking that first step and trying it out. You know, it's you don't have to commit to a full kind of process, although you'll probably find yourself enjoying this space. I think that definitely reach out to someone. There are people that do care and that can accompany you, even in times where it seems very hopeless and helpless. And yeah.
Thanks so much, Garrett. So just to re-emphasize to everyone who joined us today, we are wrapping up and we are so appreciative of your time. But just to re-emphasize that NPOwer is there to support you, your organization, your employees, the individual, anything that you are struggling with in regards to mental health, compassion fatigue, feeling just totally overwhelmed, please do give us a ring. Like I said, be it on the individual level, or even realizing that your company or your organization as a whole, the employees are struggling. There is fear, there is anxiety. Pop us an email and we will see how we can support you and everyone who falls underneath your umbrella. On that note, I'm going to hand back to Petri. She's just going to share some FAQs with you. Again, if you do have any questions, pop them in the chat box. And again, a huge thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Crystal, and also thanks to Andy and Garrett who've been joining us today. Firstly, I would just like to say, you know, with us working in NPOs, we do tend to feel overwhelmed and burnt out. And like our board member said in the previous webinar that we had with NPOwer, was, you know, the first step, or the most important thing in preventing burnout or curing burnout is not to get burnt out at all, which is, I'm sure, easier said than done. But you know, just on that note, it's important to have boundaries for yourself within your family, within your work, and to look after yourself. You know, we often say at SADC, you cannot pour from an empty cup. So you have to look after yourself in order to look after others. So it is important to keep your cup filled up and to look after yourself before you can look after others. And that is something that is so crucial in preventing feeling overwhelmed, in preventing, feeling so burnt out. And just to punt that previous webinar, it was so great, just as this one was as well. We're in the process of uploading so many helpful resources to the NPOwer website. And for those of you who haven't been to that website yet, there are these valuable kind of self-help tips and things that you can employ yourself just to help yourself not getting more burnt out, or just to prevent that in the future. So those are just some simple things that you can do with yourself and at home. And then again, just like we've said, if you are feeling alone and you are feeling like you can't reach out, you are not alone. People like us, people at SADC, people at NPOwer are there to help you, and that's why we are doing these kinds of things, is to just reiterate and make sure that everyone knows that there is someone out there, at least one person, who are willing to help you and get through a difficult time. So yeah, I just wanted to start off with that. And then just some FAQs from NPOwer. What exactly do we do? If you don't know, so NPOwer is obviously, like we've mentioned, a support program and a 24-hour toll-free helpline. We offer free mental health care and support to all NPOs in South Africa. NPOwer services include telephone counselling, face-to-face sessions, group debriefing, and support groups, as Crystal has mentioned. What do these services cost? These services are completely free of charge. The NPOwer helpline is open 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We pride ourselves in that, especially at SADC, that we are always operational. Through COVID, we have been completely operational. There has not been one day where we haven't been working. And then also, who can use NPOwer? This is obviously, I have been punting it for NPOs, but it is available to anyone in NPOs and their family members. So you can make use of those services. Yeah, I encourage you guys just to reach out. If, like you say, if you are feeling alone and you can't reach out to those support structures that are available in your organization, check out our resources, check out the website, check out all our social media. I'm trying to constantly share some very helpful self-help tips on there on a constant basis. So even if you can't, or even if you feel like you can't reach out to the support programs within your professional realm, you can do some things by yourself, reach out and just empower yourself that way. Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks so much, PG. Okay, so just a final reminder, these are all the different ways that you can find and contact NPOwer. SMS, the call center, via email, and a massive thank you to everyone who joined us today, who took this time out. There is help out there. We want to help. You are not alone. So please do call us and reach out. And then just a last final reminder, if you could take a few minutes to fill out our survey, we would so gratefully appreciate it. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Stay warm, stay safe, and all the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Garrett. Really appreciate it.
Bye. Go NPOwer. That was a nice job, guys.
Thanks so much, Andy. We really do appreciate all your inputs.
Of course. All right. Bye.
Keep well. Bye-bye.
Bye.